I'm supposed to speak about impediments to Africa's growth. Let me say that in picking the theme of this year's Camden Conference, the organizers could not have come up with a more appropriate, more timely theme. This year's theme of the Camden Conference is the New Africa. And I bet you have all heard it before. Maybe last year, possibly 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago. It is one of the most recurring conference themes around the world, and there is good reason for this. It is because every time good people take a good look at the state of Africa, they wish it could be better. Hence the never-ending calls for a new Africa. Sadly, this new Africa, whose prosperity reflects its share of the world's resources, this new Africa, whose contribution to the global economic output correlates with its share of the world's population, this new Africa that promises its youthful population a happier, safer, and better standard of living than that of their parents, has remained elusive up to now. A new Africa has become a favorite subject at conferences such as this, in lecture halls of universities around the world, in the media, at the IMF and World Bank, and in the great halls of the United Nations. The new SDGs announced by the UN last year are yet another attempt by the frustrated world community to wake Africa from its slumber. But I'm doubtful they will not suffer the same fate as their previous edition, called the MDGs, that simple and basic as they were, proved quite an insurmountable challenge for the majority of African countries. So, there is no disagreement that the world desperately needs a new Africa. Personally, I believe an Africa that is growing, prosperous, safe, and a great place to live for its people is within the realm of possibilities. And before you start thinking that I'm one of those Afro-pessimists, please know that I'm a very optimistic African. I love the continent. I live there by choice. I love it, and it means everything to my family and me. I have big dreams for the future of the continent and its people. And I believe these dreams can be realized in my lifetime. But I'm also a pragmatic African. And I've lived long enough to listen to far too many stories of Africa's coming growth and prosperity that didn't materialize. For reasons that defy logic, Africa has continued to punch well below its weight. It has refused to live up to its great potential to deliver on its promise. And I think I have a sense of why this promise has failed to materialize. It is because I believe our hopes for a better Africa have not been based on an accurate and realistic assessment of the continent's strengths and weaknesses. Maybe there's been a lack of honesty, too, in these assessments, and a tendency to aim too low, especially when dealing with solutions to African problems. And the UN's MDGs of the last 15 years being a case in point. The conference organizers wanted me to speak about the subject of impediments to Africa's growth. There are far too many of these for me to list in the short time that I have to speak here. So I'll focus on what I consider to be the big two, namely, Africa's twin problem of low productivity and high population growth. A lot has been said about Africa's so-called spectacular growth of the last 20 years. On average, most of sub-Saharan African countries have grown their economies at a rate of 6% per annum. They have enrolled a record number of children into primary school, especially more girls. And many more Africans are able to choose their political leaders through democratic elections than at any other time in history. That is how lightly Africa's achievements are measured today. And it should therefore surprise no one that if you take a closer look, you will find out, as some of the speakers have spoken today, that far from moving forward, Africa has actually retrogressed, or at best marked time, over the past 20 years. Now, given Africa's relatively small economic base, a 6% annual GDP growth cannot by any stretch of imagination be considered great, unless, of course, the world has a unique metric for Africa that is different from the rest of the world. How else do we explain this? That even after 2 decades of sustained high rates of growth, Africa continues to be the world leader in all the wrong things. Unemployment across all ages, extreme poverty, with 36% of all Africans live on less than $1 a day. Inequality. Sub-Saharan Africa has the world's highest levels of inequalities. Vulnerability to natural disasters and epidemics, floods, droughts, Ebola. Exposure to killer diseases such as malaria, TB, and HIV. Armed conflicts, terrorism of late, and political instabilities. Currently, Africa is only surpassed by Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, which I consider special cases. Human rights abuses, child soldiers, number of refugees. Mozambique is the latest to join this sad journey of refugee production. Somalia, Burundi, Mali, South Sudan, just to mention a few. And there's one more little thing where Africa leads that should scare the hell out of all of us. Africa has become, for quite some time now, a net food importer. Now, why is that scary? Because Africa is poor, so how do you become a net food importer? With what money? So when China kicked off its spectacular rise through economic reforms in the early 80s, it had more or less the same population as Africa today. The difference between China's rise and that of Africa, however, is that during that period, China was able to achieve continuous double-digit growth between 14 and 18% for 30 straight years, against Africa's 6% over 20 years. In the process, China liberated more than 40% of its population from extreme poverty and transformed itself into the world's biggest manufacturer of everything, from basic clothing to sophisticated electronic devices for companies such as Apple, Cisco, and others. China even replaced the West as the biggest giver of ODA to African countries during this time. The 20 years of Africa's growth, on the other hand, has created the developing world's most unequal societies, with the top 10% of Africans controlling 45% of the continent's GDP, and more than 36% living on less than $1 a day. This so-called growth has created a socioeconomic time bomb that has already gone off in some places. China achieved this remarkable feat by preparing its human resource to take up industrial jobs. China methodically and deliberately trained millions of engineers and technicians over several decades before they are ready to claim the badge of the world's biggest manufacturer. China was graduating as many as 600,000 engineers through its colleges every year by 2005, that's 11 years ago, and intends to have 200 million engineers by the year 2030. Africa, on the other hand, has seen a mass exodus of students from STEM subjects in favor of easier arts and social sciences. The majority of African engineers today are either retired or, like me, approaching retirement. The total number of active engineers on the African continent is less than 500,000. Yet we hear African politicians saying this is the century of Africa's industrialization. Nothing wrong with that noble aspiration, but my question is this: how can we industrialize without engineers, technicians, and artisans. A closer look at Africa's demographic and economic statistics reveals a gloomy picture of Africa's future if drastic measures are not taken to improve the productivity of Africans. Africa today has 14% of the world's population, but contributes only 3.3% to the world's global output. China has 18% of the global population and contributes 16% to the world's global output. Just a comparison. Africa has 36% of its population living on less than $1 a day. China has got only 5% of its population living below poverty line. In China, it's defined as $2 a day. China has deliberately reduced its population growth to 0.6% a year, while Africa continues to grow at 2.5%. Africa has less than 2% share of global trade against China's 9%. Africa imports, this is very important, Africa imports 83% of its food, while China is self-sufficient and a net exporter of food. Food in China is cheap and accessible to most people, while a growing number of Africans are struggling to get enough proteins for their children to grow up as normal adults. Today, China has the world's lowest rates of unemployment, while Africa has the highest rate. And this is more worrying considering that close to 80% of the African population is below the age of 35. And as my predecessors on this stage have said, Africa's growth has largely been fueled by commodity exports, which have now lost their allure in global markets. The commodity boom is officially over. African countries whose economies are not diversified enough, such as Zambia, which relied heavily on copper, and Ghana, which relied heavily on oil and cocoa, are already feeling the brunt of this commodity trade slowdown. More will follow shortly. And apart from Africa's growth of the last 20 years being too small to make a real difference to African lives, it was not a result of any deliberate economic planning decisions by Africans. It is only coincidental that China and India happened to be in a hyper-growth phase that required them to import commodities, and Africa happened to be the world's richest source of such commodities. Africans did not instigate the sharp rise of commodity imports into China and India, quite on the contrary. But if you go and read any of the 6 5-year development plans of the Communist Party of China that span this period, you'll be able to identify sections of these plans that speak directly about the role that African commodities would play in China's growth. Now that boom's end has caught us unawares and unprepared, and the hard times are upon us with a vengeance, one more time. And it's like we've seen this movie before. And one of the least talked about issues about Africa is its declining food production. In 1980, according to the FAO, Africa had an almost balanced agricultural trade, when both agricultural exports and imports were at about $14 billion, but by 2007, which is 9 years ago, its agricultural imports exceeded agricultural exports by about $22 billion. Today, as I said earlier, 83% of the food consumed in Africa is imported, according to the African Development Bank. China today is a net food exporter, and it's instructive to note that a small country such as Thailand produces more rice than all of sub-Saharan African countries put together. And rice is one of the most popular foods in Africa, as you know. So what is worse, food in Africa has become much more expensive, meaning that only a select few can afford the imported food. Today, far too many African children grow up without being properly fed during the critical phase of their development, leading to worrying levels of brain stunting among Africans. In one region of my country, the prevalence of brain stunting was as high as 58% last year. So why should this be happening in a region that is said to have more than its fair share of arable land, fairly good rains, and the world's youngest workforce? The whole world is puzzled by this. There is a report which was authored by the FAO in 2011. It's called Why Africa Has Become a Net Food Importer. And one paragraph I found quite interesting said that Africa has become a net importer of food, of food and of agricultural products, despite its vast agricultural potential, is puzzling. The core finding is that population growth, low and stagnating agricultural productivity, policy distortions, weak institutions, and poor infrastructure are the main reasons. For me, I would like to focus on low productivity of Africans. And I think it's high time we looked at each other in the eye, and started telling each other some inconvenient truths. It's time Africa started pulling its weight. Last year, I had the opportunity to speak at the IMF World Bank spring meetings, addressing the IMF Africa Advisory Group. And on a similar subject. And I had to start by defining what sustainable economic growth means to me, and I believe means to most Africans. And I think that Africans should have aspirations that are no less than the aspirations that people elsewhere in the world have, which is that people should be able to earn through honest work enough to live a dignified life, to send their children to school, to save some money for a time when they are not going to be able to work. And they should be able to have a hope, if not for themselves, but for their children, that their future is going to be better. Because if people cannot have that kind of hope, then a lot of terrible things can happen. Without hope, growth and stability will face disruptions and even reversals, as we have witnessed recently in numerous African countries, from Somalia to Central African Republic, some parts of Kenya, Nigeria, and even South Africa, Burundi, Mozambique. No country is immune to such disruptions. And I'm of the view that sustaining current successes, including current rates of GDP growth, will not be enough, not by a long shot. We forget that while 6% GDP growth for 15 years is impressive in the current global economic context, Africa is the continent where inequalities are so extreme, meaning that we cannot measure our economics in Africa using the same factors that have applied up to now. I think we are a bit of a special case. I think sub-Saharan African countries must aspire, therefore, for annual GDP growth rates closer to 20%, and for a sustained period of no less than 30 years, if current generations of Africans are going to have any hope in their future. And this calls for African economic planners also to learn to plan their economy better. Now, one indisputable fact of life is that if you don't want population growth to harm you, at the very least, make sure that your productivity outpaces your consumption. This has sadly not been the case for Africa, and worrying signs of stress brought about by too many mouths to feed with so little are becoming increasingly visible. Having said that, no amount of productivity improvement can cope with the numbers of young, poor Africans that are added to the continent's population each year. This means we need to wake up to the serious threat that uncontrolled population growth poses to Africa's future. And even this alone may not be enough. We need to do extraordinary things if we are to keep the African continent on a sustainable growth path. In 2014, the World Bank published a report that my country, Tanzania, which has got a population of 50 million people, produces more than 800,000 new job seekers every year. Of these, hardly 10% are equipped with any relevant skills, meaning that the majority are unemployable, even if jobs could be found for them. The situation is no different. During the same period, Côte d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, country of 23 million people, produced 500,000 new job seekers, and the government reported to have created during that year only 2,000 new jobs. To understand the enormity of the employment challenge facing Africa, and African countries today and in the future, we need to consider how many formal or meaningful jobs exist in African economies today, what is being done to generate new jobs, and what difference these efforts are making. So I'll not bore you with too many statistics, but if this could be of any help, Tanzania has about 2.5 million formal jobs. That is the combination of the private sector and public sector jobs. So, and we are creating 800,000 new job seekers every year, most of them without any skills. So, and then we continue to grow our population by 2.5% every year or more. And this is the same almost everywhere in Africa. So the absence of jobs and the hopelessness it's causing has already started to cause worrying social trends on the continent. Last April, more than 10,000 desperate young Africans made the risky journey across the Mediterranean to southern Europe on rickety boats. Hundreds died and more remained unaccounted for in 1 week. This has become a weekly occurrence now, and all indications are that we will see more of this, not less, people risking lives to escape hopelessness in their countries in Africa. What is most often lost in the noise surrounding this issue, and especially now with the migrant crisis in Europe, nobody talks about the many Africans that are still trying to make it to southern Europe, is that a growing number of these desperate young people includes people holding university degrees and diplomas, meaning that even people with such high and rare academic qualifications don't see hope for themselves in Africa. Hopelessness leads ultimately to acts of desperation, and what began a few years ago in Nigeria as random acts of violence in other African countries is beginning to take on forms of organized reaction to what young people refer to these days as the indifference of the elite, a small but powerful group of people that has captured all power, both economic and political, for its own ends, at the exclusion of everybody else. The growing tension caused by the lack of hope among young Africans is the single biggest threat to Africa's future, given that no government can create the number of jobs Africa needs. There is a need to think outside the box on what can be done to bring down population growth to sustainable levels. among other solutions. Now on governance, transparency, and fighting corruption, the theft and sabotage of our economic assets by a privileged few remains a big problem in Africa. Until recently, oil worth the GDP of a mid-sized African country was being stolen every year in Nigeria. There is more of the same almost everywhere you look, with only a handful of countries such as Rwanda and Botswana showing a deliberate and keen effort to keep corruption under control. The popular reaction to corruption and abuse of public assets in Africa is increasingly becoming violent, and understandably so, given that many people are desperate, and as I've said earlier, you all saw the example of Burkina Faso, Egypt, even Tunisia. The Arab Spring to the north of Africa was triggered by people's unhappiness with corruption in places of power. Corruption contributes directly to the systematic weakening of state institutions that are supposed to check its spread, such as the judiciary, police, anti-corruption agencies, revenue authorities, and other regulatory bodies. And this causes ordinary people to lose hope in a better future for their lives. And this is why I see the fight against corruption, lack of transparency, and for better governance as being one of the most important areas of focus for African governments going forward. We must view the fight against corruption in Africa as a matter of life and death. If we fail here, everything else we are trying to build will come down crumbling. The fight against corruption and efforts to improve governance and transparency must, however, go hand in hand with a drive for innovative new ways to generate new forms of employment on the continent. Let me reiterate that now is not the time for complacency. Single-digit GDP growth is not enough to sustain our growth trajectory. We must work harder and aim higher. Secondly, we must recognize that Africa's development will need to take a different path from those taken by the developed North and the emergent South Pacific. The government's role in the creation of jobs will have to be profoundly different, focusing more on facilitation of self-employment rather than direct employment. In conclusion, let me say this. Next year, the first country to gain independence in Africa, which is Ghana, will celebrate its 60th anniversary of freedom. Many more similar celebrations will follow in short order across the continent. As we celebrate what are without doubt important milestones of African life, we must ask ourselves what we have done with our freedom over the last 6 decades. How much of it, if any, is left? We must understand and wake up to the harsh reality that the responsibility for delivering the new Africa that the world is calling for rests squarely with the current generation of Africans. We cannot afford to fail. Thank you for listening to me.